Right, greetings, hello. Welcome back to the Philosophy Club. And here we are in the middle of France, in La Creuse, the magical heartland of old France. And so just a little recap on what happened this week. It's all been quite interesting. And I was involved with watching a film this week made by a French team about the life of the great Druid Celtic warrior leader called Vercingetorix. He's like the French equivalent to King Arthur. And it's a recent film made by French cinema with animation and documentary. They've gone to the sites where these conflicts took place, including Alesia, which is in Bourgogne, not far from here. And it reminds us really of how tragic that conflict was between the Celts and the Romans, and so unnecessary because they actually really worshipped the same kind of pantheon of deities. The Latins had different names for them. Like they called the king of the gods Jupiter. The Celts called the king of the gods Tyrannus, but they were functionally the same. And a friend of mine once asked me, as peace druid of Britain, you know, it's all very well being into peace and being a druid, but what do you do if a Roman army turns up on the doorstep? Do you not fight? You know. And I said to them, and I still uphold this, that no, I would have gone and had words with the archpriests of Rome, the Pontifex Maximus, who was the chief priest of the ancient Roman religion. When I knew trouble was brewing between the two cultures, I would have gone to Rome and said, look, one of your crazy warlords, Caesar, is thinking of attacking Gaul or Britain. You've got to rein him in. And I would have prevented the conflict happening in the first place. So the Druid way is to prevent the war, to prevent the conflict, by going to the nub of it, going to the heart. And those chief priests, the pontifexes, would have, I believe, done their best to stop it. It's interesting that the word Pontifex Maximus carries on in the Catholic Church because they believe that the Pope inherits that title, the chief priest of the ancient wisdom traditions of Rome, which are very druidical actually. Numa Pompilius, who founded the Roman religion, lived about 700 BC, was a Sabine, and according to Plutarch's biography, was a very learned, wise, and spiritually guided king. He was like a druid king, if you want. And at the same time, in ancient Ireland, there was Olaf Fodla, who was a druid king in Tara, around about the same time. So these kind of wisdom leaders would have prevented war, in my opinion. Caesar, however, was not reined in, and he unleashed this mass slaughter on the Gauls. It's assumed somewhere between 1 and 2 million Gauls perished because of Caesar's invasion. They were either killed outright or put into slavery. And in fact, it was charges were brought against him in the Senate for war crimes, quite rightly. But rather than go and face them honourably and defend his actions, he chose to march his army on Rome and take over control of the city-state and have himself appointed as basically everything. He did a kind of trump, like an attack on the capital, and to have himself instated as chief leader. And so as a Druid peacemaker, that's the problem, is what do we do with illegal warlords who act like that? So anyway, I've been thinking about this a lot, and this week we had a meeting of the World Intellectual Wisdom Forum, which I chair, which meets every month, normally on the 30th, but we met on the 28th. And we were discussing these issues. We heard a very great talk from Dr. Elena Mostakova, who is an American from Bulgaria. She's now gone back to Bulgaria, living in Sofia. And she's an enlightened social scientist, psychologist, and futurologist, looking at how we can steer the ship of the planet in the direction of peace. She presented a very interesting talk about the stages of adult moral development, which was her PhD thesis. So she looked at academic research into how human beings, how we evolve as mature adults. We kind of grow out of our adolescent, I've got to do it all my way or I'll beat you up type of thinking, gradually to a, well, let's find a common ground, let's do it our way. And then up to a even higher level, which she calls the transcendent level, which is let's do it our way, but also let's invoke the divine intelligence. What would the spiritual realm want us to do? And she mapped out how these different stages are always coexisting on the planet. People are at different levels. When the planet gets into trouble is when too many people are stuck in the lower levels of ego behaviour and not enough at the level of transcendental morality. So we had a very interesting talk about applying that kind of analysis to contemporary global problems. And then also, on the same day, I attended the African Peace Studies Conference, which takes place every week, organised by George Mutalemwa in Tanzania, discussing the life and work of a professor of peace studies, Johan Galtung, who was one of the founders of this form of peace studies. He was Norwegian. He was a conscientious objector. He was someone who found Gandhi's work against violence and colonialism and imperialism very persuasive. He was friends with Arne Næss, the great eco-philosopher from Norway, who was inspired to look at deep ecology. And he took his work in peace studies into sociology and mathematics even. Johan was a great personality. I met him several times and we were discussing this online with others who'd known him, Professor Lester Kurtz and Francis Hutchinson in Australia, others in Africa and so on. So it was a fascinating discussion about what is peace studies, why isn't it working? We've had 50 years of peace studies since World War II, and yet we don't seem to be able to stop the Ukraine war. We've got a kind of Caesar going on with Putin. Again, how do you stop someone like that, who's immune or thinks he's immune to international law? And I've read that he's just launched $1 billion propaganda campaign against everyone that doesn't agree with him. His agents are now infiltrating Western social media, particularly. I mean, a huge amount of investment. He has thousands and thousands of people posting fake news to demoralise Ukraine, to demoralise the West, to demoralise and to support Trump's election stuff. So I find that scary that wars are now going on the internet with social media, vast investments. But anyway, so we were discussing all this and what we can do as academics to counter this. I mean, we can hold on to truth. Gandhi talked about holding on to truth. To be a peace worker is to be a satyagrahi. That means someone that holds on to truth. And, how do we do that? So I also attended this week on Thursday a discussion from Israel, from the leading progressive newspaper in Israel called Haaretz, which I recommend people to look at or subscribe to. They've been covering this war in Gaza, Israel, pretty well, I think, fair to all sides. They try to see the bigger picture. They have people in, all walks of Israeli society. And it was a webinar about Israel and Netanyahu and his relationship with America. At what point will America lose patience with Netanyahu and just say enough is enough? I note that after the shootings in Gaza, tragically, when some aid was being delivered, Biden is finally doing airdrops of supplies. I mean, Israel is playing like not allowing enough aid in. And so the only way to do it is airdrop it. And that's what the King of Jordan has been doing, personally flying planes to drop supplies into these starving people. Children are dying of malnutrition as we speak in Gaza, and I think that's utterly, utterly unacceptable. And Biden finally, the penny's dropped, and he's now... I mean, the Allies sent in a Berlin airdrop at the end of World War II when the Soviets blockaded the city and wouldn't let supplies get in. Let's do the same. And I'm afraid if Israel starts shooting down American planes, then, you know, that's that's an escalation that they probably even wouldn't want to do. So, yeah, I hope that there's a serious airdrop, not just a few token crates go in, because we have to save these lives. It's utterly, utterly tragic. These people have been swept up in this. They're not collectively guilty for the actions of a few crazy Hamas people. And most sensible people realise that. So the discussion was all about this, and featured two very, you know, up to the minute people who have, you know, who have sources inside the Biden administration where discussions are going on as we speak about what to do. And I attended a meeting also on religion and contemporary art that was very interesting by a group looking at spirituality and the arts. And I've been active with the Delphic Games this week as the education coordinator. We're putting in a funding bid to the European Union, which is trying to support, you know, culture and the arts. One of the main functions of the European Union is to do that. So we think the Delphic Games deserves some support, and a team of us are working on that. And I hope, you know, positive news comes. Yes, so it's been a busy week, and you know, let's hope that gradually the work we do as intellectuals, academics, philosophers, and so on, makes a difference, and people begin to realise that the path of peace is the one to follow, not the path of violence, and that includes intellectual violence. You know, planting untruths in the internet is a form of violence. The Janes, who I organised, I attended a conference and helped organise the academic side of this conference on peace and non-violent action, run from Rajasthan, the previous week. I think that makes the point that the Janes make. There's violence you can have violence of thought and violence of word, as well as violence of deed, and you should refrain from all of them, and try and find a non-violent solution to differences or difficulties by finding truth, because truth is common to all of us. If we all go for truth, then we can get non-violence on this planet. If we don't, I'm afraid we're not going to succeed, because untruth is what causes violence. And that was something that another teacher of peace studies, John Burton, always said, that the cause of conflict is always in miscommunication, you know, and not finding common truths. So let's get on with that and attempt to find common truths. That's the point to me of philosophy. That's why Pythagoras travelled around all over the ancient world looking at Egyptian, Phoenician, Greek, Babylonian forms of philosophy, and then came up with a kind of synthesis. That was the beginning of philosophy as a system of thought, which Plato and others built on later. Okay, so that's my introductory thing for this week. Let's go back to our periodic table, which we look at each week. We always like to... well, before we do that, let's just talk briefly about this guy, Iain McGilchrist, that you were drawing to my attention. Tell us why you think Iain McGilchrist is onto something. What's he saying? What's his argument?
He's watching the evolution of the society since maybe the 18th century or the Renaissance, where the reason took the main place with the development of scientism.
Right.
And he said that he's using the metaphor and also based on his studies, because he's a psychiatrist,
Right.
On the left brain and the right brain. And he said the left brain is the part logical, and the right brain is more getting the information from the environment, all information, and the left brain is making the synthesis of this.
Right.
And the left brain should be the slave of the right brain. And he's saying in our society, this is the contrary that happens. That the left brain becomes the master, and we analyze. So by analyzing is cutting. We are cutting the life. So we are studying not life. We are studying peace, peace of life.
Sure.
And making machines or algorithm is fruits of reason. But if we put the reason as a master, as an objective, as a way of behaving, we go on the meta crisis we know in the present times.
Right, because that's been caused by this split, hasn't it?
Yes, yes, and what my comprehension of Ian McGilchrist is very low because I'm not a native English speaker, and but it's a kind of intuition that this guy has a very important talk and could help us to understand what is going wrong.
Right. Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And I've been watching some of his talks. He gave a Darwin lecture. I came across him through my work with the Scientific and Medical Network, which was a body set up in the 70s by some old colleagues of mine, and it's still going. And this brings scientists and medical doctors together, looking for a new paradigm of science. So we want to keep science, but we want to change what we mean by science. And so some of the leading thinkers around the philosophy of science have been giving talks to them. Ian McGilchrist gave us a talk not that long ago when he said more or less what you're saying. You know, his big argument is based on neuropsychiatry, the split between right and left brain, and this over-privileging of the left brain with its hyper-analytical ability to look at things individually and in the particular. It's got particular facts, details, logic. What the right brain can do is look at the overall thing and get the bigger picture, the meaning of it. So anyway, do listen to him if you haven't seen his work before. It reminds me of my youth when I was in my 20s. I went to work at the National Hospital of Nervous Diseases in London, which is the leading institute for neurology and neuropsychiatry and brain research in the UK, in London. This was in the early 80s, and I worked there as a nursing orderly. It's very close to the British Museum, and I wanted to work there because it was close to the British Museum Library. So I'd work night shifts in the hospital and then go and study in the day. I loved that job, and I loved the hospital. And I used to use the library, which was supposed to be for the doctors, but I got a ticket. I could go and research there because it's the Institute of Psychiatry of the University of London had links to it. And I got into studying Western brain science a lot because it's fascinating, and I looked at the history of our knowledge of the brain, because it was in that hospital they treat people who, say, have a head wound that shoots out part of the brain. They then repair it. And I remember when I was working there, the Israeli ambassador to Britain was brought in as a patient because he'd had part of his brain shot away in some terrorist action. They also treat epilepsy and all these mysterious diseases of the nervous system. So I studied in depth, the history of brain science. But then I was also interested in other models of healing and medicine and physiology. So what's called subtle physiology. I was looking at the Vedic or Indian systems of subtle physiology, Ayurveda, and the idea of the chakras and the energy systems, and that you should treat people at an energy level, not just like physically, but that there's a subtle body, that we have a subtle body as well as a physical body. And so, what form does that take? And I was trying to, well, this is my 20s, I was trying to reconcile the two models, Western medical physiology, you know, and then sort of Eastern, Oriental, subtle physiology. And there were people actually trying to do that. I discovered there'd been conferences of medical doctors trying to reconcile the two systems. I don't think we've reconciled them yet. I think I don't know McGilchrist's knowledge of Eastern subtle physiology and what they have to say about the chakras, because there's the top chakra, which is the sort of place of synthesis, and then there's the the sort of third eye here, and then there's the throat chakra, and the interrelations between the three. I'd love to see that studied by both Oriental doctors and Western science, and put the findings together. What I do know is that in the Eastern system, which is Buddhist and Hindu, is that the place of highest illumination is one of synthesis. So I'd say it's where the right and the left brain come together. And we need both right and left brain to act in symbiotically. In both perspectives are valid. I don't agree with McGilchrist that one should be the slave of the other. They should both be the slave or servant of the absolute, which is the place of synthesis, which is enlightenment. In my, that's my position. And that both right and left brain are needed, and that, Wallace Stevens, great poet, wrote a poem called 19 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, which is one of the classic poems, and we need all 19 ways, But anyway, no, thanks for recommending him, and he's a good thinker. Okay. Well, look, let's choose, and what we try to do in this philosophy club is use both our left and our right brains. So we look at it analytically and with detail, but also the bigger picture and the meaning and the feeling behind it. Okay, so choose one at random, or you can
I
choose
have
one you want.
one question.
Yeah.
Do you have in your periodic table something close to anarchy? Because you told me about Proudhon, and
Yes.
it raised my curiosity, so I watched a few videos on the net.
Oh, right.
And do you have something?
Yes, he would be in the in 165, political theory and practice. So Proudhon is referenced in box 165.
Can we go on that box?
Okay, you choose that one, 165. Okay.
I was going to go with Sumerian.
Okay, what number's
That
that?
might be quite a big leap.
No,
30.
that's fine.
Number 30.
Right. Okay, we can do those two. That's going to be fun. Yeah.
We'll travel a
Excellent.
lot.
Yeah. Well, we'll start with the Sumerian because it's kind of very ancient, and I've always been fascinated by Sumerian culture. When I discovered it was the oldest, civilization on the planet, really, in the far south of the Tigris and Euphrates Delta, what we call Mesopotamia. There were these ancient temples built in Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, Lhasa, Isin, and so on. There's a whole... And archaeologists discovered them all, and it was British archaeologists. I'm really proud of the history of British archaeology. Because we went and... That was part of Iraq, and we had archaeologists, therefore, because we had a sort of a mandate over that region after World War One. We dug up a lot of these sacred sites and found tablets with cuneiform writing on them. And this had been translated previously by scholars of language and so on. And so we could read the sacred texts. These were a very religious people, the Sumerians. The temple was the most important building in their cities. And these are the first cities known to history. That's what's so interesting about them. And they had priests, and they also had sages called Apkalus. They had a reverence for learning and knowledge, so they would love the philosophy club. They loved philosophy. it's said that Pythagoras himself went and travelled there, and there would have still been wisdom of the Sumerians alive. The oldest texts of the world come from there. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a very famous ancient literary work, but it has philosophical overtones. And the bit that I always loved is Gilgamesh goes on a voyage to find immortality, which don't we all want to be immortal, right? And he's told to go and see this very wise sage called Utnapishtim, who lives on the coast near Dilmun, which was their paradisical place. He goes and reaches Utnapishtim, who says to him, yes, you can find immortality. You have to dive down into the sea at such and such a place. And down there's a herb of immortality. If you bring it back to the surface, if you swim to the surface holding this herb of immortality, then you will be immortal. I can show you, what to do with it. So Gilgamesh dives down and he finds the herb, he grasps it, but on the way back up to the surface, he's attacked by a sea snake serpent and he drops the herb and he has to come back up for air, and that's gone. So Utnapishtim tells him with, sorry about this, that's the only chance you get. You only get one chance of this. Anyway, I was always fascinated by that story. And that's the reason why we're not immortal. So, and when I went to Macedonia to the Struga Poetry Festival one year, I was there on the shores of Lake Ohrid, and there was an exhibition of poetry and paintings and photographs, and one of them was a lament for Gilgamesh losing the herb of immortality, like a contemporary Macedonian poet. So the tradition lives on among those that know. There was a whole pantheon of gods and goddesses. Enki, the god of wisdom, Enlil, the lord of the air. These have their own cards in the Tarot of the Gods that we'll see. An, who was the lord of the heavens. Ninlil, who's a goddess. And, they all have their stories. I mean, Sin, S-I-N, was the moon god, very important deity. These are absolutely fascinating, and they had priestesses as well as priests, these temples, on equal terms with the men, and some of their hymns have come down, It's not known what language the Sumerians actually spoke. It wasn't Indo-European, it's thought, and it wasn't Hamito-Semitic, so some people say it was more like Finnish, Finno-Ugric, more like the shamanic languages of Central Asia and Siberia. Scholars are still working on this, and in my dictionary, which the Multilingual Dictionary of Global Philosophy, this is the first dictionary of philosophical terminology in all different languages. I don't know why, but nobody's ever thought of it or done it before. And I've got Sumerian in here. The Sumerian word for wisdom is Adapa. Their word for God is Dingir. And, life is Ti. And also, a rib is Ti. And it's thought that the biblical story that God made Eve from the rib of Adam is a sort of pun taken from Sumerian, because life and rib are both Ti. Ti. And we do know that the Sumerian mythology got into the Bible in a number of places. So the myth of Noah and Noah's Ark is originally found in these Sumerian texts. There was a deluge, a great flood, and it was Utnapishtim who was the Noah for the Sumerians. That's why he's so wise. He was warned by Ea, the god, to build an ark, exactly like the Bible. And Utnapishtim builds an ark and rescues two of everything, and his family and all that, and they survive, and they become the ancestors of us all. Now that's a Sumerian legend, which our archaeologists found, in these tablets. So, and that's not the only sort of biblical story that's grounded in the Sumerian religion. But one of my ambitions, if I live long enough, is to do a critical, analytical version of the Bible, Old Testament, with different color codings to where it came from. Was that a Greek legend? Was that a Sumerian? Was that a Babylonian? Was that a Egyptian? Because the Bible, as we know, is a pastiche of all these ancient cultures. Because the Jewish people, or the Hebrews, were great travellers. They spent time in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the north of Syria, in the Holy Land, and they picked up stuff wherever they went. And that's all gets into the Bible. But the Sumerian contribution is amazing. One of the reasons I was so against the American and British invasion of Iraq in 2003, why I marched against it, was because, well, the Iraqi people had nothing to do with any of the accusations that were being hurled at them. They had no weapons of mass destruction. They had never anything to do with the events of 9/11, even though the American media pretended they did. The whole thing was a con. And we, I don't know about we, but the Americans particularly, and the British, bombed a lot of these places and slaughtered lots of people in the very homeland where the Sumerians came from. And the museum in Baghdad was looted, and some of these precious things were got rid of. I mean, you know, I still think it was an utter disgrace that the West, whatever that means, felt that it had the moral authority to go and destroy Iraq. Okay, Saddam Hussein was not a particularly, pleasant pushover of a guy, but he kept the country together. He was a moral Islamic socialist. I suspect the American hysteria against Saddam Hussein was just, they have this red flag if they see the word socialist. They want to bomb it, which is, a problem with the American neocons, particularly, who were behind that war and behind the kind of merciless witch hunt. So, on behalf of my Sumerian ancestors, I think that was all totally wrong. We should have sent in teams of scholars to discuss truth. Because Iraq is an amazing place for wisdom teachings. And we should focus more on the Sumerian culture in a peace-loving way, because the Sumerians, their highest virtue was peace. There's still lots to be discovered about them. And there are quite a lot of texts in the British Museum, where I used to study, the British Library, from the ancient Sumerian culture. A guy called Noah Kramer, a scholar, is one of the world's experts on Sumerian religion and philosophy. They believed in wisdom, in seership, in prophecy. Particular prophets were honoured. The divine powers and the interconnectedness of all worlds. So we humans can access these higher states of consciousness. And it's thought that Enoch, who also gets in the Bible, and is particularly in the books of Enoch, which are 3 very important books. We know that Jesus knew certainly one Enoch, possibly 2 Enoch, are probably modelled on a Sumerian priest sage, who we know from history was a priest of the sun. And scholars think that that's the antecedent for Enoch. And again, it's something that gets into the biblical tradition from Sumeria. So, why not go back to studying wisdom is my argument as a philosopher, rather than bombing people because we're on a propaganda roll, because we're fighting over oil. I mean, the true wealth of Iraq is wisdom of the Sumerians and the Babylonians, not oil. I mean, oil's great, and we love it, but let's honour the wisdom of these people. And it lives on in the Sufi traditions, so if I was having this conversation in a downtown cafe in Baghdad or